Next, I do want to introduce our keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Vindell Washington. Dr. Vindell Washington is the Chief Clinical Officer and Head of Health Equity Center of Excellence at Verily. Dr. Washington provides clinical leadership across Verily's research and care product suites and currently leads the company's Center for Excellence for Health Equity. Previously, he served as Chief Executive Officer for Onduo, Verily's virtual care solution for chronic condition management. And before Verily, he was the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Louisiana, where he oversaw a network of operations, contracting, medical policy and quality, disease management, and pharmacy benefits. That's a lot. Dr. Washington also served as a National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, the ONC, in the federal government, where he provided high-level executive direction and leadership for ONC programs, operations, and policies. He also served in several capacities at Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady Health System, including President of the Health System Medical Group, Chief Medical Information Officer, and Leader of the Health System Quality and Information Technology. Dr. Washington received his MD from the University of Virginia and MS in Healthcare Management from the Harvard University School of Public Health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vindell Washington.
I'm excited about the talk today. I will have to give you a little bit of inside baseball. We have a communications team in all transparency, and this is supposed to be my bio slide. And I looked at it the other day, and it had all these big pictures. And when I was younger, it was like, okay, this is meant to give you credibility. When I looked at it yesterday, I thought, well, they're making these bigger and bigger and bigger. So maybe it's like senility versus credibility. I'm not sure. It's some balance between the two, but truth be told, I have had a couple of different jobs across my career path, and it helps sort of set the stage for what I want to talk about and things I think are going to be important in terms of innovation in the future. So I did work at a health system. I worked at a health plan on the dark side, as some might say. Worked in government for a while. But one of the questions is, why did I end up at a big tech company? And I would say to you that, I'll start with a bit of a story. I will tell you that this pathway concept that you're basing this innovation event on, I think is super important. And for me, what I had at that point in time was several jobs where I dealt directly with health centers, where it was pretty clear that doctors really wanted to be in quality and value-based programs. And I knew the health plan audiences, that the health plan was really willing to give up the risk. But what I thought was truly missing is the right kind of data platforms and tools to allow people to fully participate. So why did I leave? Why did I leave the sort of confines and safety of health plan life or care delivery life? It's because I did not believe that we had the right tools to really engage in the effort that was necessary for the moment. Too many failures in my eyes about what could happen. The second element was really clear to me today as I sat through your presentations. It's still 15, 16, 17 years from innovative new discoveries, many of which you talked about today, before those discoveries make it to the bedside. And I'm particularly passionate about making sure people can live better lives. So at Verily, we have this mantra, this idea of precision health, being able to use data to get down to the individual patient for the right interventions, making sure that it happens every day. And for me, in my role as the lead of our health equity efforts, to make sure that there's no community that's left behind, is one of our mantras. So the way the talk is structured, I'm going to go relatively quickly through a few points, and then I want to land on really the innovative work we're planning on doing with our CU partners, UCHealth partners here, and I'm really excited about that. So for those of you who may not know Verily a little bit, Verily is a company that's grown out of Google's bets. So Alphabet has many bets, started as Google X. So as a company, we care about what's happening in the technology space. And in particular, we pay a lot of attention what's happening in the search space. So in this first portion about what's happening today, you know why this slide actually caught everyone's attention. So this idea about AI is not a tomorrow thing. It is absolutely a today thing. This is a short snapshot in time, but I will tell you that if you're in Mountain View, California, and you see that search has gone for healthcare issues, has dropped 10 points in 1 calendar year, you know that something is no longer the same as it once was. It's the engine that drives Mountain View. And it's not a hypothetical thing. So yes, last year, I think number 1 was maybe Charlie Kirk. Number 2 was the K-pop Demon Hunters. But health is down by 10 points. So people in Mountain View are paying attention. I'll also say to you, anyone who's done any of those searches, whether it's ours, Gemini, or OpenAI AI or others, the kind of responses you get back seem personal, seem targeted. It's not tomorrow's future, it's today's future. I won't spend much time on sort of the state of virtual care. You all know that from what's happening in your system from day to day, but this is no longer a thing that might happen in the future. It's certainly a thing that's happening today. And I'll pause just a bit to talk about what's happening across the ecosystem as those silos of delivery, payment, et cetera, come together. And what I'd say to you about that is it's not tomorrow's idea that they're going to deploy AI, it's today's. I'm not sure that everyone has the right approach. We'll talk about partnerships and why we think so highly of the work we're going to do here together with you. I'll share one anecdote about it. I went to a conference a little bit ago. The morning conference was led by a health system. They talked about the fact that they had figured out the secret sauce behind getting around denials. They didn't even read the denials. They had large language models that took every denial, turned around a response, scrubbed, and sent things back. In the afternoon, I went to a health plan session. They talked about how the utilization management tools generated denials at a faster rate than ever expected. That is not the kind of innovation we're hoping to see in the future, but the construct there, you can see that people are excited about the work. They know that it's a new world and they know things can change. So what really has to happen in this space and what's possible in this space? So this is unpublished, but this is Washington's idea of like what the spread is going to be across the technology space, particularly when AI is concerned, and what will make it into like the mainstream in the next year or two and what will take longer. The one thing I'll point out to you is that anyone who stands before you and says they know exactly where this is going to land, I will tell you they're stretching the truth a bit. I think generally what we know today is that things are done from an algorithmic perspective. AI is ready today, maybe it was ready yesterday. So if you're jumping in, that's the right place to jump in. But I'll point to this sort of idea of where AI tends to fail in terms of care delivery at this very moment. And that really comes back to us being people. So underneath the people who are sort of doing the prompts is an individual who has pain, an individual who has stress, an individual who's worried about something. And I'll tell you, it's just not an unusual situation to say healthcare is not like other areas of life. That is to say, most of the communication that we receive from an individual is nonverbal communication. So if I'm going to go to the bottom of the graph and say we're going to be talking about really things like end-of-life decision-making and diagnoses, the fact of the matter is your inputs are going to matter. And the research has not changed in healthcare. A touch on the shoulder, eye contact, a feeling that you care about me and you care about my well-being. I'm either excited to be here and pacing your stage across your stage or seated in the corner, kind of quiet and trembling. You pick up lots of things about the individual, and those are important when it comes to those decisions. AI is not ready to do that today, but this is the landscape we're looking at. You also see a lot of data about this construct of where AI can be from models that exist in other industries. And so, in all transparency, at our company, we think deeply about how our sister company Waymo has done this work and what is the path one might take from doing the work AI does today well, like this straightforward algorithmic work, all the way to more agentic, free-form diagnostic work. So we have an idea about how it could work, but I will tell you how you get there matters a lot. So many of you have probably seen this study about like simple triage activities. This is not the nuanced kinds of diagnoses we talked about in terms of psychiatric health earlier this morning. This is not things we're looking for, these digital biomarkers from folks with kidney disease, as we saw this morning. This is just trying to get triage correct. And the fact of the matter is today, in the current state of things, LLMs, as they come out of the box, are pretty good at telling you what the right next word is that should be said, but not necessarily ready for prime time in terms of doing the first thing we take as our mantra in medicine, which is the first do no harm. So the framework that we think about a lot here is how do we actually pivot from here to rising to the moment and doing the right thing for the patients that we serve and the research that we conduct. So in terms of how we get to this point, I'm going to skip around just a bit. Verily's approach in this construct, I think, centers on some principles, specific principles on how we should think about AI, talk to others about AI, do our development process. I'm going to point out a couple of things in our framework that we think is important as you go forward, and we would encourage our other colleagues like ChatGPT Health and others that you've seen in the deck. And that is to say, people do need to know how the watch works. I like the comment earlier today about like not telling people about the 11 herbs and spices. That was a great comment. That was really funny. But the construct of saying, I'm going to make a life and death decision. You give me a bunch of data, something's going to happen that'll come out of the other side of the box, but I cannot tell you how I'm weighting the variables, whether or not your income, your race, your biometrics of some type or another, your proteomics matter in this decision making. We believe that transparency there is going to be really critical. This thing about does it work? Are you generating real world evidence? What kind of testing are you doing? Do you meet the highest scientific standards? I do not think we're going to get a pass in this industry, in this space, without us leaning into the construct of what is good science and good delivery. And I will say that it is not acceptable or appropriate to produce models that systematically leave communities behind. If we're going to do this work, it has to make us advance as we go forward. We can't have our sins of old move into the new world of AI just because we're basing our models on all that exists in the internet. I've been there. All that exists in the internet is not good, I'll tell you that. So the framework here is really important in terms of how we have principles that we do our setup and structure and framing for the work ahead. So we come with this sort of construct about what we think meaningful partnerships are, and we're happy to talk about that a little bit further. But it's a real critical element before you start in the science. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the underlying work we're doing, but the principles have to be rock solid. We still have to hold to not doing any harm. We have to hold to our principles of making sure communities are not left behind. People need to know a little bit about how the watch works, transparency, and how this is done. And our scientific principles can't be compromised in any way as we go forward. So for us, we have three kind of approaches for healthcare AI that we focus upon. One is this idea about information exchange. I spent many years both coming up to and in the Obama administration, walking around the country preaching about interoperability and data sharing, but actually it's the bedrock of the work that we do. Information needs to flow, silos need to be broken down, and for these large language models to work, they're using the entirety of the internet. If we think we're going to build smart either scientific or research or care models, and at the same time have hospital A unnamed and hospital B unnamed, not have any information share, any ability to get the key data elements, we will not have a top tier solution if that's the way we go. We think that this idea of precision, and I'd love to talk today earlier about the biometrics and the proteomics. We think that's a key element in trying to get to the individual from a delivery perspective. That's right. And then the construct of making sure that there's no such thing in the future as research grade data is another passion that we hold as we go forward. There shouldn't be the idea that, particularly in this day and age, and what we can do with data sources, that we settle for data that you can't build models on, make assessments upon. Like, we should improve the quality of data that exists generally. I have one or two, what I would say, kind of more framework slides, and then we'll sort of switch into something that's a little more specific about the work we want to do together. But I just want to have one slide that kind of describes more specifically what I'm talking about in terms of the platform. We're sort of talking beforehand. I view in large part some of the partnership work we're trying to do together with you as helping to make the roads, and then you can drive your fast cars on top of the roads. So one of the key elements is it's super important to have the right data flow into the systems before you do your AI agents, make your discoveries, do your digital phenotyping, do your proteomics and biometrics. I promise you that we will not have a great health system if we have a framework that says you have a chronic disease, and if you're a perfect patient, I might see you 4 times a year for 15 minutes. That is not the future of what we see from a healthcare perspective. So the data from your wearables, the data from the phone that you carry, data from surveys that happen. We had a couple of those presentations today where what's happening with the individual today matters. Data about what we've traditionally called social determinants, social drivers, where you live, do you have a car, do you have any money for the appointment that I'm asking you to pay for, deductible for, those things are going to be important. So our model is from a construct perspective, that data has to all flow. It has to have an ontology. It has to have provenance. I need to know where it came from. I need to know if Washington can look at it, if someone else cannot look at it, a researcher, yes, care deliverer, no, whatever those rules are have to be there. And they have to be curated in such a way that it is fit for purpose for the work to be done. Then our framework is that you enrich the data, curate the data, give it provenance, then it's ready for the model building that we heard a bunch of people talk about today. So at Verily, we don't see our role in the smart model development that we heard about earlier in the presentations, but we want to make sure that the data is ready across a wide variety and spectrum of areas for this kind of innovation to occur. And then there has to be a real world evidence to it. So it's not just that the models are developed, the models need to be tested, they need to show themselves worthy. I'll flip back to that, Waymo slide. You don't let the car drive until you're very confident that in San Francisco it's not going to run across a bunch of people in the median. This is the construct of way AI models should develop and work and grow before they're allowed to graduate. And then this circle, this virtuous circle of monitoring is what follows. So this is the framework that we believe is a critical framework at Verily in order to allow the innovation and the driving of care to the highest level that's important as we go forward. This here is more about the company. I'll spend 1 second on it, again, because the commercial team would be really angry with me if I did not. It's just to say that in addition to building the road at the bottom, we also believe that there's some first-party solutions that are necessary. I will tell you that if you're going to divide the time that a company like ours spends in this space, a small amount of time, relatively speaking, is spent on the first-party solutions. We need to know what to build in the platform, but we're looking really for great partnerships and great innovators to build upon the platform. So there is Verily Me, which is the direct-to-consumer app. You can download it now, not right now, but download it in the future if you want. It's around engaging people and giving them information about their health status. It's a free app. And then it leads into some of the other solutions like our research registry solution and our LifePath, our chronic care delivery solution. But the idea is there that these are all powered in part by models. We have provider in the loop or physician in the loop for many of these models. But the construct that's really important is to have a knowledge of what needs to be built. And then in terms of the innovation research, I heard a lot of great things again in the presentations earlier. We also know that it might not just be the data set that you have or you have access to today that is important for the next discovery. So gathering data sets like the All of Us data sets that the NIH has sponsored or the UK Biobank, those are all things you might need as you're trying to get your assessment of the next new discovery to be made. We all have heard in fact, I know based on conversations, you have really some subspecialized care areas that you're leading the world in. But the fact of the matter is you cannot have Verily help train an AI model with the 250 patients that exist here. So we have to have a framework that allows us to partner when the time is right to do these partnerships. And the last thing I'll say about this is it's really important for us that these methods that we're putting forth have this circle learning loop. And what you'll see here is 4 publications. I'm not going to talk through each of them, but I'll just say generally the idea is if I'm going to put forward, for example, a triage agent that might gather some information about your mental behavioral health status, how do I know the ChatGPT of the future is not going to give you a bad answer. And how important is it for me to not have it not give you a bad answer? So we think that the publications in this space are critical. The data generation in this space is critical. I learned when I got to Verily what some of the mantras are in Silicon Valley. You probably heard some of these before, but one of them is ship it and fix it. That's sort of that's the way you go through a lot of development. Healthcare is not a ship it and fix it kind of framework. So the studies and the work here has to happen as you go forward. I have two slides I want to talk quickly about in terms of our view on health equity and how it should sort of play into this. I will tell you that our sort of centerpiece on this, we don't spend a lot of time talking about subgroups of subgroups. We spend most of our time talking about individuals. And that's sometimes a lesson you learn the hard way in this business. And you know, like one of my sort of failures in this space, when I was at Blue Cross, we got the ability to give lift rides to individuals to help them get to appointments. So we had mapped out areas of the state that we thought people should use lift rides in. And we had allocated them based on what we had determined from social determinants and income. You know what doesn't tell you exactly who needs a ride to the doctor's office? Their income. So if you go to New Orleans East, one of the failures we found is sometimes Miss Susie has a daughter who is at the bedside, ready to go. And sometimes there's a $2 million house on St. Charles Pace and people still need a ride to get to the office to have things done. So the construct is an N of one. So one of the things I wanted to share with you in terms of how we think about getting to these outcomes is this idea of, hopefully this works, this idea of doing away with the focus group and going down to individuals and making sure for every product that we develop, we have a group that stays with us through the length of the course of the project. And the reason that's important is everyone has heard of the idea of the 2-hour focus group. I bring folks together, I say what's important to you, I start a design, but there are 100 decisions that are made from the start of a project to even the first prototype that comes out in 18 months. So one of the things we've decided is there's no group that we're going to work with that's going to give us input. And actually the shortest we have right now is 18 months. And why is it 18 months? Because we don't want to get to month 14, have a critical decision and not have a close contact with the communities that we're trying to design for. Let's see.
I would say it was supportive. It was you know, encouraging. And it was also like understanding, you know, because it's saying, like I said, you know, in the office 3 times a week, just sometimes inadvertently you just pass the chocolate bowl and, you know, grab some kisses and go back to your desk and eat them as you're working. So, and like, you know, it kind of said small steps, you know, instead of replacing all of the milk chocolate, maybe two days out of the week make an effort to do some dark chocolate and berries instead of the milk chocolate we have around the office. So yeah, I thought the AI bot person was, you know, understanding, supportive, and encouraging.
Yeah, so the point here is not so much, so she's actually talking about one of our dietary bots that we work with. But the point is, every time we introduce a feature, every time we think about a twist that we're going to put into the application, we want to have as close a contact with the communities that we're designing for as we can. To get to an N of one, I need to know how individuals are perceiving the interaction they're having with the bots.
I would say it.
Okay, I have one more sort of quick slide, and I'm going to pivot to talk about our partnership, which is the thing I'm most excited about this afternoon. One is I want to break one myth in the room, and that is really about what happens with your EHR and what is possible within your EHR. So one of the things I know as a former CIO is if any of your docs come into the office today, and when they click the order button, it takes 40% longer, you're getting a call. No one is sitting around for the spinning hour of death when that opportunity happens at their bedside. And what I mean in terms of an area of focus is that your transactional data systems are close to maximum at their peak usage. And most of the time, I actually didn't talk with Steve about this, but most of the time people plan for those areas and they have some capacity above that. But what systems that we're talking about in terms of this new AI world do not have is the compute or capacity to do all of the fancy AI tool activities we're talking about on top of the Cerner, Epic, Athena Health systems. So one of the things we thought was important as we're trying to have these future ideas and conversations is, can we have a framework that takes this multimodal approach and that allows for the kind of compute that's necessary? Today, where do you get that? I mean, the biggest company in the world in that space, actually, I think it might be the biggest company in the world, period, but in that space is NVIDIA. And the reason is not because NVIDIA has the answers. In fact, when we've had our conversations with the three of us in the room, the first thing NVIDIA says is they don't have the answers. They don't know the questions to be solved. They don't have the framework to do the work, but they have the compute. So we're going to have to do things that we have not done in this space before if we're going to be ready to do the kinds of innovations and innovative things that this health system and research group has decided to do. So I have Kim's quote up there to talk about the partnership. We're super excited about the partnership, but I want to talk about just a couple of ideas here. So we've partnered in the idea of trying to bring the solutions that I've been talking about together with your research folks to do this work in the most effective way. So I'm gonna say just a couple of quick things. I think I see the shepherd hook coming up. I think I've been talking too slowly there. It's a nice, he's nice, but he does have a shepherd's hook. So I'll say this because you know about you, but I will underscore that you are a unique institution, both in the way that your research arm works with your care delivery arm, the educational aspects of what you do here. So I'm not going to tell you more about you except to say we think you're special. I want to talk a little bit about the use case that made us come together here. What I would say to you that I think is super important is that in many of the discussions earlier, we're talking about a more precise diagnosis. And we talk about it in the shop. So we have this Leeuwenhoek's diagram from the Dutch microbiologist many years ago up to a more modern microscope. But the idea is we're going to have a better view of the individual disease you have. I'm going to talk about AML, but I'm going to start with something more simple. I'll start with hypertension. Why is it that I could get that diagnosis tomorrow and I could get prescribed a calcium channel blocker, I could get prescribed an ACE, I could be prescribed an ARB, I could get just prescribed any number of meds for this. And if you read the algorithm of how I should get treated, it literally says, try this for 2 months. And if it doesn't work, move from your calcium channel blocker to another, try that for 2 months. The fact of the matter is, it's very likely that those are not the same diseases. My friend Rich talks about heart failure. I won't be as eloquent as he is in that space, but the bottom line is what we talked about and demonstrated in our work with you around AML is that it's probably not the same disease. Now, you had done the work. We got it as a test and worked on it together. But the construct here, I think, is a super important construct, which is to say, in order to do the kinds of discoveries we want to do in the future about these diseases, we need a sharper ability to tell disease A from B from C. So we can first develop hypotheses and talk about the interventions that might lead to the future innovations. And we also need to be able to do this work in such a way to accelerate and nudge folks at the bedside to do the right thing once we've figured out what those things are. Those things all require the kind of infrastructure and support that we've talked about. So the punchline here is that there's a monoclonal antibody drug that you see in the bottom that you found and you gave us the test. And we also refound it. But the two things that were important is we found it very quickly, which means that the cycle of discovery can be quick and more on point. And we're super excited about not just this use case, but the same use case can be applied to many other treatment areas. You heard earlier Kim talk about pancreatic cancer, but the reason I use a simple example like hypertension is because we know that there's something different. There's heterogeneity in those diagnoses, not homogeneity, which makes certain therapeutics work in one case and not work in another. This is, I think, our collective view of how medicine and research is going to really change in the future. This is a little bit of our test result, and I'll just point out one thing right now. This is back to what AI can do versus what AI can't do. So when we looked at lots of things like the PDFs of proteomics testing, et cetera. It's pretty clear if you look at that, AI will make a guess. It turns out if you put really smart physician informaticists in the mix, it gets better. So the right graph that you see is a more linear correlation. Once they went back and redid some of the connections and collaborative elements of the work on AML, like use more cognitive thought about how the two should go together than just a mathematical try. So we think that that's an element that's here. And then lastly, I'll end with this slide, which is my favorite slide, which is, I think if you take that example of what we're able to do together, and you think about what we can do in the future, what we're going to end up doing in the future, in my opinion, is this idea of the digital twin that you heard about earlier. And so what that means is with the right amount of compute power, you're going to be able to take a particular diagnosis in a particular setting. And as we said before, to an N of one, the people matter. So an individual who has a set of characteristics, and you're going to be able to simulate what the next best action should be and give a close to real-time clinical decision support intervention. That is the new way of research. That's also the new way of care delivery in medicine. And that's what we've committed to do with one another. The one thing I want to sort of talk about in terms of that cycle is, in terms of the paradigm shift, is that it is a cycle. It assumes, just like in the ChatGPT slide I showed up earlier, that the large language models are getting smarter. Properly built healthcare models, in our opinion, are also going to improve across the span of time. And our vision and this collaboration is absolutely aligned with yours, in that we will be able to have a scenario where you will simulate an activity, you'll predict an outcome, you'll have an intervention, you'll do your tests, you'll optimize, and then you will have precision care, no one left behind, and a treatment algorithm that is state of the art and pushes things forward even into the future in research and care. So I thank you all for the time to talk about this. I'm super excited about the partnership, and thanks again for the opportunity. Always great.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think that was an incredible introduction to the partnership. I've asked Dr. Richard Zane to join us, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Innovation Officer for UCHealth. We have 2 emergency physicians here, so we're going to have a lot of emergency medicine doctors. But I thought it'd be interesting to hear both from Dr. Zane and Dr. Washington about their views. Rich, could you talk a little bit about what you see as the promise for this partnership?
Well, a couple things first. You can never have too many emergency doctors.
Here.
See that? That's it. That's all I needed to say. So I think that we are on the cusp of what is going to be the future of healthcare, which is the partnership between an integrated academic health system, a university, scientists, technology around data, and then technology around hardware to do things faster, better. And the vision is real-time dynamic clinical decision support for when a provider is seeing a patient. Many of you know that it's challenging, as Vindell alluded to get a diagnosis. And in the United States, if you have an immunologic condition, on average, it takes 3.5 years and 7 physician or healthcare encounters to get close to a diagnosis. The same is true for heart failure. The same is true for hypertension. So what we want to do is to be able to build a dynamic ability so that when you are encountering a health record and you are speaking to a physician, that in real time, the AI, through our partnership, is delivering a diagnosis and a recommendation for what's next. So we want a physician to be encouraged to do this instead of that, and doing this instead of that will make a diagnosis.
Dr. Washington?
Those of you who are close enough can see.
I think they're switched to the
They
hand.
switched.
Yeah.
Okay. So those of you who are close enough to see saw us doing like a bunch of hand signs across the way there. So hopefully that wasn't too distracting. We're like, I gave a little bit of the sort of punchline up front, which is I think that some of this work on the more precise diagnostics is what we're most excited about, because there's a lot that follows from that. both the research aspects that we talked about earlier, the care delivery aspects, and then really this ability to do the real-time bedside nudges. I think, one of the things we talked about in particular about digesting information is that physicians' time is compressed. It's ever compressed. And so when I was leading a medical group a few years ago, more than 10 years ago, we had a switch from 30-minute appointment slots to 20-minute appointment slots. If you were going to get a consultation, we switched from an hour to 45 minutes. I'm not sure in any way whether or not that is in the ballpark of what's being done here or not. But my point of the matter on that is that is not enough time for an individual to read 10 years worth of a medical history, to digest that and figure out the next best action. It's not that the providers are any less capable, but the ability to have that stuff be done and to have the right nudges come and some transparency that lets me know I'm confident in the recommendation I'm getting, we think is really a game changer in the way that the medicine will work in the future.
Great, thank you. I think we have a lot of researchers in the room. We heard from some of our faculty innovators. Changing directions just a bit. Could you talk a little bit, Dr. Washington, about how the researchers can engage and how you think about your research partners as you think about Verily Health?
Yeah, one of the things that we're excited about is, as I was mentioning before, making sure that the pathways are easier to navigate and that the research itself is easier to get done. So if you think about what are the tools that are necessary, one of them is making sure that the data is in the right position for the research work to be done. This is this idea about refining, cleaning, making sure that from a perspective of usability, it's ready for the kinds of questions that researchers want to ask. The second is, can you actually navigate that data? Are there tools that sit on top of the data set that allows you to create cohorts easily, that allows you to look for outcomes, like an ease of use construct? There's another toolkit that we talk about that's really around making sure that it's easy to enroll people in clinical trials, find folks, enroll them in clinical trials. One of the newest enhancements there is making sure that you can actually judge the complexity of the trial. So your first has to be digitized for you to judge the complexity of the trial. Why is complexity important? You want people to actually complete the clinical trial. So knowing whether or not having a person come in 3 times a week for a blood draw makes it more or less likely your trial is going to be successful or not. That's a simple example. But you get the picture that having the nuances that lead to good science and that lead to high evidence or completion of the trial is important. And then we think really being able to put that in a package with the right kind of access and security that's necessary, and a framework that's FDA ready for SAMD and other oversight is critical. So we're super happy to try to bring those things together to make the work of the researcher easier.
So many of the researchers and many of the clinicians and many healthcare systems believe that they're sitting on a gold mine of data. And it probably turns out they're sitting on a salt mine of data, as it turns out. And 30% of the data in the world is healthcare. And it turns out that maybe 1 or 2% of it is actually AI ready. So what would you advise an investigator who's starting a clinical trial to do differently going forward, thinking about that?
Yeah, I like the way that you frame up the problem set, because I do think it can be overwhelming in terms of the data that exists before you. But some forethought is necessary when you're doing your design and you're gathering in your data sources. And so, again, one of the things we're hoping with the partnership is to have a path forward that allows that to be the easy path, where both the data that comes in and how it comes in is well thought out. The quality of that data, there's a pathway to do the cleansing and the sort of treatment of the data that's necessary for the AI models. But to your punchline, it is very true that not every set of data that's available is a data set that's really going to allow you to run an AI model on it. And even when you think, I sort of made an offhand comment to the sample size, but it's not really an offhand comment. So the reason that many of the models, like search, for example, work well is with dirty data, is that there's so much there's so many swings at the bat. So if you have a billion searches that happen, if you have a few 100 million that are not actually, they are nonsensical, it doesn't stop you from doing your data work. On the other hand, you're treating very complicated things. You're studying very nuanced elements. If you have 250 of a particular disease type in your state and you're doing this care delivery, having an attention to the data, the cleanliness of the data, the provenance of the data as you're doing your designs, I think is super critical.
So right now, I think if you asked every clinician in the room and gave them truth serum, they would say
Sounds
that
dangerous.
propofol, truth serum, whether it's open evidence or Claude or Perplexity or other, every single clinician is using an LLM to guide them to do the next thing in some way, shape, or form.
Yep.
So what is the regulatory barrier? What has to happen next to let that actually get into clinical care and allow that to be part of the way we make decisions, just like we embed pathways or guidelines?
Yeah. So one of the things I think is super interesting about that question is the bottom line is there is not enough formal framework or regulation in that work. So I would say open evidence is very interesting because they've taken a pathway that's different than ChatGPT or Claude in this space. And one of the things that's critical is what are the data sets that you're training your tools on? And so we've spent a lot of time talking about what is the pure data set, what's the golden data set that we want to start with, and what are we going to allow these cycles of improvement to sit upon, because they don't stay the same. It's not a static sort of framework. So in our opinion, part of this is you start with a vetted, even straightforward algorithm, much less an AI algorithm. You start with a vetted algorithm. You do turns, but you do turns in a limited sense. You don't do terms on all of the internet. You don't do terms on broad LLMs. And then you actually have a testing strategy that goes forward. So what we've talked about in our shop is you should think of LLMs that are in this treatment care loop much more like an emergency medicine physician in practice than you should around a medical device. So a medical device, it's pretty straightforward. I expect the defibrillator to work the same every time it gets the particular signal that it's getting, and that's how I test whether it's working. If you take an LLM, for example, and I know that over time it's going to give a different answer to the same question, we are hoping it's a better answer than before. It looks much more like the aging emergency medicine physician, where you say, well, there's a certain standard around board certification, around learning standards, that there's a frequent sampling and testing strategy that checks for drift, that checks for bias, that checks for basically wrong answers. Did it drift in the wrong direction? And so we think that's really what's going to happen from the long regulatory perspective. But to directly answer your question, the reason you can get things like triage agents that miss 20% of critical cases, like the article I put up in front, is that there is not it is not ready for prime time if you sort of open it up today and say, I'm going to upload my UCHealth record and I'm going to ask some complex problem. It is not vetted in that way. The large language models are not vetted in that way. We hope, I think, from the development standpoint, to produce something that has that kind of transparency, reliability, and efficacy that allows people to do that.
So all of us have had the occasion to take care of patients who've spent a lot of time on Google search before they come see us. And it has some intrinsic frustrations, I think, is true. And I contrast that with patients who spent some time on an LLM. And when you help them write their prompt to more accurately describe their condition, it's pretty inspiring. And then I always say to the patient, the next prompt should be, are you sure? Right? And you ask the LLM, are you sure? And the answer changes. And it's a pretty remarkable experience for a patient to go through and a provider to go to, just to say, are you sure? Could this be wrong? And the answer changes.
Yeah. I mean, it's a core, folks may know this, but I'll sort of underscore it. It's a core framework with large language models in particular. Large language models want to be liked. And so if there's a flaw in just the general development, they're kinder and they look to give you the answer that it appears you're searching for. That's the initial flaw in design from the broadest LLMs. This is back to our construct of how do you create a healthcare LLM? Well, the first do no harm principle means that even if I think I want you to tell me to take bromide for my hypertension, that's not something to joke about because I know that was a bad outcome. But like we have specific outcomes where people have pushed LLMs, gotten the wrong answer that have had catastrophic effects. The construct that we're talking about here, though, is that if you're going to rely on an LLM, it needs guidelines. So one of the papers we published, I didn't talk about the papers, but one of the papers we published was specifically around if you are dysthymic, depressed, having an acute episode, how likely is the LLM to recognize it and to give you the right prompt? And broad ChatGPT is not particularly good at that. And so building guardrails and frameworks, we think is a really critical question.
Great, thank you. I know we wanted to open it up for audience Q&A, so we'll open it up to the audience for any questions that you have for any of the panelists.
Hi, thank you so much. Neil Epperson, Chair of Psychiatry here. I guess I don't know whether I'm encouraged or discouraged that it takes 3 or 4 different types of medication to manage some people's hypertension, and that, you know, the cardiologist or the internist doesn't have those data. So maybe I was telling my partner here that maybe we should take Neurovesica and apply it to hypertension as well. But in any case, you know, a lot of these large language models I think are really fascinating, and you know, and I appreciate that Verily is really focused on making sure that they apply to all people and not just some. But when I think about different areas of illness, like mental health and mental illness, so much of it is the context. And, you know, applying large language models and pulling out words here and there, you know, a lot of companies have not done so well. I guess I'm wondering, you know, do you guys, does Verily have something that they're really excited about in the mental health space? And if not, what could we fantasize about together?
I'll share a little bit of our experience. So we had a company called 115, which was, believe it or not, the number of people who were dying of opioid overdose at the time the company was started. By the time Verily spun the company off, it was almost twice that. And so a very tough area. We started in Dayton, Ohio. But there was some of the rudimentary elements of what I talked about today behind it, which is how can you actually do a better job at diagnosing the individual and have an evidence-based care framework around it. So we started with what I would call some pretty basic work in this space, which is the ability to monitor, get triggers from individuals from things that are just mostly like PRO kind of survey question elements. We also found out very quickly that if you try to do a standard 2 or 9 question survey for individuals every single day about their mental health, it does not work. You have to have more of a conversational element in it. So we learned some of that. Natalie Lester was a psychiatrist who ran that for us. One of the things that I thought was super interesting in terms of the promise of AI in this space, it turns out that it's really hard for a psychiatrist to say, today you have pressured speech, and when I saw you last 3.5 months ago, you had less pressured speech. It's also really clear that with even just cameras that are on everybody's smartphone, the evolution has gotten to the point where Google Health or Google Science, the Paris group, was able to say, I can actually tell things like flushing. I can get your heart rate from the flexion from the camera piece. I can look at the dilation of your pupils. So the idea of a recorded visit and cycles in that and adding that as a biometric measure, as opposed to saying, I think Vindell's speech is 20% slower than when I saw him 20 months ago. We think that there's promise in that space. We don't think, and I think maybe this correlates with the presentation that was given, we don't think that they're great biometrics today, but we think that there are possibilities in the future. And the last thing I'll say, and this is the thing that's exciting to me about this, the other parts of science here, I think proteomics or omics generally is sort of underrepresented in the way people think about these disease types. I go back to the idea that, and it's not just hypertension, there are lots of medications that have first, second, third line drugs that we know individuals that only respond to the third line drug. And what we've said before, at least when I trained 100 years ago, we said before, they all kind of work. We'll toss them out there. It's all the same disease. It is much more likely that we were trying to use, a Leeuwenhoek's microscope from the 1600s, and we should have been using a sharper microscope to know who should have gotten the treatment. But I think that's what's going to happen in areas like behavioral science.
I had a question. This is great macro data review. Is there a thought at some point to use this technology in the exam room with a clinician through a scribe agent or other ways to get the data into the system in a more standard way so that the data can be run easier on the back end?
Yes. In fact, right now we're using ambient listening for examinations, and we're deploying ambient visual as well. So the real goal is that a physician or a provider or a nurse takes care of the patient. The ambient listening or visual can do the documentation, can do the coding, can do all of that. But think about what happens when that then is structured in an AI-ready format almost immediately. It can go into an AI engine, and then real decision support that's evidence-based can come back instantaneously so that it can prompt the physician to ask the next question or prompt the nurse to do the next thing.
So really interesting presentation, really interesting work, Vindell. I'm going to put on my statistician hat to ask this question, but with the thought of LLMs, what occurs to me is you guys are taking very disparate, dirty data and making it usable in kind of a coherent format. So why rely on LLMs? Why not go back to classic machine learning techniques or other deep learning techniques, which frankly, Google is the pioneer of?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good call out. And in all transparency, I didn't go into much of the detail of the development, but much of what's been developed is not just the broadest elements of Gemini, for example. So I'll use a non-technical example. For our coach interactions, we have an AI agent called Violet. For the coach interactions, the source code for the learnings were the 7 years of coach patient responses. And could we have used a straight Gemini engine to say, this is what a person might say if a patient says this, and gotten a reasonable response? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. But the element of like, what are you going to train the models on is a key piece. The other thing I will say, this might sound a little bit sacrilegious, but I think it's what you're getting at, which is not every single problem in healthcare requires an LLM or an AI agent to do. There are absolutely problems where machine learning techniques or, if you think about a lot of what we do in our app, for example, on meal logging, the simple pattern recognition activity that says, yes, this is a bowl of cream of wheat versus this is a bowl of grits, and this is the calorie counts, et cetera. This is not a large language model. Clearly, it is. I mean, the point of the matter is, I think that underneath the engine, if you want to be super technical, there will be several types of both calculations and analytics running based on the problem set that's meant to be solved. I do want to say one thing, though, back to the comment that Rich made. If you want to live that vision that he's talking about in terms of nudges and real-time work, we don't have the compute today to do that work in the speed that's required. And quite frankly, telling me 2 days later, when I was last in the emergency department, I had 3 cases, I should have asked something different, is not particularly helpful either. This is this unique period of time where, with partnerships with us and NVIDIA and others, we might actually be able to bring that to a real-time cycle where that compute can be used in this particular way.
Hi, thanks for your presentation today. This is great. I have one quick question about data. I'm wondering, you mentioned some challenges with data. I'm wondering what trends you're seeing now as AI is evolving in terms of data licensing, whether it's gotten easier or more specific or more difficult, and how that's played out in your world.
Yeah, well, I think underlying some of this is a set of policies that actually lead to data and data exchange. So without being political, I would say that the HHS Trusted Exchange Framework agreement is a good thing. I think that healthcare data is sensitive. I think people are reluctant to share if they think there's risk in sharing. So having a national framework that says this is the right instance in which to share data, I'm talking about EHR data on behalf of the individual. This is one of those policy areas where I would say, even if you believe firmly that HIPAA should be different than it is today, the one thing HIPAA got right is that it's your data and your data should be protected. So a framework that says I can more easily share health information exchange data or EHR data with an institution of my choosing, I think that is an advancement in this space. I will tell you, one of the things that was super disappointing, though, after rolling out our direct-to-consumer app, there's some pockets, and I don't mind calling them out. One of them was actually New York City, where even though it was a well-wired market, it's a very competitive market. And if for some of those institutions, if you want your information to flow from A to B or to device manufacturer down the line, you have to go in and actually sign a piece of paper with their medical records department. Anyone have a flashback to 1990? In order to have your information flow more freely from one stance to the other. I would say in terms of governmental agencies, I would say NIH in particular has been thinking pretty deeply about data sets like the All of Us data sets and what should your access as researchers be to data that was gathered on behalf of the American people in that particular way. I think that's a push that's happening. And I also think that some of the work that FDA is doing and trying to open up and have a single data flow platform that says that certain data elements should be able to flow from A to Z or promising activities. But as we sit here today, I mean, it is true. It is very difficult to get all the data that you want, even if you have the most altruistic of means there. And so we're leaning in pretty heavily to make sure, again, that your data rights are respected. And if you choose to participate in a trial, or if you choose to have your data flow from hospital A to B because you want a second opinion, or if you just want to carry it around and ask your friendly LLM some questions about your data, that you have easier access to that data.
So I think we're at time, but in closing remarks, I think just going to do a quick audible here. I don't know if all of you know, but right here at UCHealth, if you think about what happened with Google Cloud Platform, we were the first to co-develop Google Cloud Platform for health with them. And that was under the direction of Steve Hess, who's been our partner in this journey. So in closing, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Hess to give his vision for the future and what he sees as the opportunities here.
So I think that Dr. Zane and Dr. Washington said it really well. What we're trying to do here and what we have the infrastructure for is to take all that data and create incredible intelligence at the point of care. So please look around at this room, at this group, what you all have done over the past, call it 10 years, to build out Health Data Compass, to build out the Centers for Personalized Medicine is actually game changing, has been the infrastructure, those highways that we can now drive really fast cars over. So none of this is easy, right? We can sit on a stage, we can talk a microphone and talk about this all day and it sounds easy. None of this is easy, but please look around, and all of you are part of something special here. And what gets me out of bed every morning to come here, use all of your bright minds, all of our data, our patients, our doctors, our nurses, and change the course of their lives. Make them better, save their life, allow them to get discharged from our hospital. So this is what gets me out of bed in the morning to be able to make all of you successful in delivering the care for the patient. So we are I think at the cusp of something incredibly special here. So be proud.